us tonight. Jeannie and I are speech language pathologists at Groves Academy, and we serve students that go to our school and come to our learning center that don't go to Groves Academy. And we work with students on all kinds of things like executive functioning skills, reading comprehension, writing, spoken language like narrative language, articulation, all kinds of things. So this is our bread and butter. We could talk about it for days. We're going to keep it to an hour to an hour and a half tonight, and give you just a little taste, and you will probably figure out along the way which areas you kind of want to dig into more or ask us questions about. Our contact information is on this first slide. So if you have questions for us afterwards and you want to reach out, feel free to use our emails and we will get back to you. So I'm just going to dive in. Before we get into anything about language, I just wanted to start by giving a brief overview of executive functioning. Looks like we've got almost 60 people here, and I'm going to assume that everybody's kind of on a different page with their understanding of executive functioning skills. So if this is something you're super familiar with, bear with us. We're just going to do a quick review. But executive functioning skills are any skills that a person uses to accomplish a goal. So it could be keeping your focus on something, it could be managing your time, it could be planning ahead, it could be self-evaluating to see what you need to do better for the future, setting goals. Executive functioning happens in our frontal lobe right behind our foreheads. It's the latest to develop, so typically we don't develop all of our executive functioning skills till we're around 25 or 30 years old. Sometimes people make a comparison of executive functioning to like the conductor of an orchestra for your brain. It's what's keeping everything together and working the way that it's supposed to. I also recently saw another SLP do a really cute little doodle where she draws a little boss man at the front of your brain and then little men in other areas of your brain or women where listening happens or where talking happens. And the big boss in the front of your brain is in charge of what all those other little men and women are doing. I'm going to go through each of the executive functioning skills. These are roughly the order that they develop in your brain. The first one is response inhibition. So this is just your impulse control, your ability to think before you act. Working memory is the ability to keep information in your mind while you're doing something with it. So it's a little bit different from short-term memory. Short-term memory would be if I said, remember these letters, C-A-T. What were those letters? And you would just say C-A-T, just right back to me. Now, if I said, what were those letters backwards? You would have to remember those letters while also manipulating them in some way or doing something with them. So you would have to remember that the letters are C-A-T, but also figure out that backwards, that would be T-A-C. So that's working memory, a super simple example. We're going to be talking a lot about working memory tonight because it's something that affects everything we're going to be talking about. And it's one of the things that people are a little bit less familiar with. So we'll dig deeper into that one. Emotional control is exactly how it sounds. It's your ability to manage your emotions, hold yourself together when you're stressed, you're angry, excited, sad. Flexibility is your ability to be able to change your plan or do something differently when your original plan isn't working out. So your ability to adapt. Sustained attention, again, it's exactly how it sounds, being able to keep your attention on something in order to take that information in and encode it into your brain, remember it, and use it later. Task initiation is the ability to get started on something without procrastinating. This is definitely my biggest area of weakness in executive functioning. We do a lot of questionnaires with our students where we fill out a survey about ourselves and figure out what our strengths and areas of growth are. And every single time, this is my biggest weakness. Planning and prioritizing, again, is a pretty common one that most people are familiar with. Being able to create a roadmap to reach your goal or complete a task and being able to figure out what's most important, what needs to happen first, what order do I need to do things in. Organization is being able to maintain systems to keep track of your materials. We also find that a lot of kids, when we're talking about spoken language, have trouble with organization and maintaining a system for organization in their brain. So they don't always have logical categories or connections between words they know or information they know. So organization can be physical stuff, but it can also be how you organize information in your brain. Time management is being able to get things done in an efficient way, meeting deadlines, being able to stick to a schedule. Goal-directed persistence is your ability to follow through with something until it's finished, even if it's frustrating or it's not going the way you want it to, or if something is distracting you. And then the very last skill to develop is metacognition. And this is your ability to kind of take a bird's eye view of yourself, self-reflect, ask yourself, how am I doing? How's this going? What do I want to do differently? How can I get better? And that definitely is one that develops the latest when we're older. Who has trouble with executive functioning? All children and teenagers have trouble with executive functioning. Like I said, it's not something that develops until we are adults, 25 or 30 years old. So all kids and teens are going to have difficulty with this in some capacity. It's really common for students with learning disorders and especially attention difficulties like ADHD to have even more difficulty than a typical teen would or a typical kid would. So a lot of students with ADHD, a safe estimate is to think of your executive functioning skills as being 2 to 3 years behind. So if you are a 10-year-old with ADHD, your executive functioning might be more like where an 8-year-old functions. So thinking about what can an 8-year-old do independently in terms of managing time, doing a routine, getting homework done is probably more realistic for a 10-year-old with ADHD than what a 10-year-old can typically do, if that makes sense. We're going to talk about how executive functioning affects reading, writing, and spoken language tonight, but in general, executive functioning affects learning both directly and indirectly. So the direct effect is that if you have good executive functioning skills, you can maintain your focus, you can remember information, it's easy for you to plan and adapt. The indirect effect of having good executive functioning skills is that you like school. You're motivated to work hard because it feels good, it feels successful, you're accomplishing your goals. So on the flip side, students that do not have super strong executive functioning skills and are struggling to pay attention, remember information, plan, adapt, may also then have the indirect effect of not loving school, not being motivated, feeling like a failure, which can then lead to behavior problems, suspension or expulsion in really serious situations. So what we want to do is really help these students that have difficulty with executive functioning, give them the accommodations and support that they need so that they can feel successful in school, feel like they're learning, and be motivated to be there. Before we move into talking about how executive functioning affects spoken language, I'm going to pause here because I just did a really quick overview of executive functioning. Any questions so far about this piece?
No questions yet, but just again, if anybody does have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will get those taken care of.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, I'm going to jump in now. I'm Jeannie Parker, as Megan said, another speech language pathologist at Grove's Learning Organization. Okay, so we're going to start with discussing how executive functioning can impact spoken language. Before we jump into that, though, I just want to clarify, what do we mean when we say spoken language? And so what this means is there's basically two separate kind of categories of that. So that's speaking and understanding. So it's our ability to produce the spoken language and then also understand it. I like this quote about spoken language. It says, "We must consider the importance of oral language competence for successful social and academic functioning." So language is just so important across all different settings to be successful socially, to succeed in school. If we think about, let's think about many different social settings. So imagine a student having a conversation with a friend. They have to have those back and forth conversations. They have to explain themselves. They have to ask questions to the peer. They have to understand what their friend is saying to them. They have to use humor appropriately in order to maintain friends so that you're not hurting others' feelings. They have to understand sarcasm. So language is huge in social situations. If we think about academics, language is everywhere. It is in all classes. It's in math class when we're doing word problems. It is in art class when we're listening to the teacher give directions. It's in reading, it's in writing, it's in expressing and discussing topics in class. So it's just really important to consider a student's spoken language skills. It's so essential. Okay, so we are going to go over 4 main areas of spoken language that are impacted by executive functioning. So those include word retrieval, listening comprehension, narrative language, and then social situations. So we're going to start with word retrieval. First, what is word retrieval? So this is the ability to recall and then produce a desired word in a quick amount of time during a conversation, whenever you want to use it. So then what do we mean when we say word retrieval difficulty? This is a failure or a long delay to say a known word that you want to use. And it's usually a word that you can comprehend and that you've spoken before. So it's not that a student who has word retrieval difficulty just has a lower, smaller vocabulary. They may understand many, many words. They may understand many concepts, but they struggle to retrieve that word and use it when they want to. So what does this look like in our students? It might look like pauses. So they might be talking and leaving huge gaps. And that's because they're using that time to find the word in their brain. They might, instead of having that pause, they might use filler words like or like as they're retrieving their words. They also might resort to using just vaguer or more vague vocabulary, such as thing or stuff or place. They might say things like, oh yeah, I got that thing for my birthday, or I went to that one place down the road, because they can't think of those super specific terms. They also might abandon utterances or abandon stories. So they may be in the middle of a sentence or the middle of the story, and they're really struggling to retrieve those words. So they may give up and not share as in-depth of stories as other students. We might hear repetitions from them, whether it be repeating the end of a phrase or the beginning of a phrase or a word as they're processing and trying to retrieve that word that they cannot find. There might be revisions. They might start a sentence, not be able to find the word, and then try to restart it a different way in order to maybe avoid that word and use a different word that would make more sense. They might say the wrong word as well. So maybe they want to say the word scone, but they say the word donut instead because it's similar, it's close. And then also it's often described as like a tip of the tongue feeling. So students often will say things like, oh, I know the word, I just can't think of it. It's on the tip of my tongue. Okay, so the 2 main executive functioning skills that are causing this, or that go into word retrieval and that are causing these difficulties, are organization and working memory. So as Megan was saying earlier with organization, we definitely organize our physical belongings, our materials, but we also organize our knowledge, our vocabulary words, our concepts that we learn. And so I'm going to give you a little analogy here. Let's imagine you are going to soccer practice and you need your specific soccer shorts. So you go in your closet and it's super organized, and you know that your soccer shorts are with your other shorts and your shorts are next to your pants. They're all on this shelf right where you organize them, right where you put them. So when you go in to find them, you find them super quickly. You can retrieve them quickly because it's organized and you know exactly where they are. Now compare that to walking into a messy closet, very unorganized. There's not really a system going on there for organization. There's clothes on the floor, there's clothes on the shelf, there's some things hung up. And so it's going to take you a lot longer to retrieve those soccer shorts because those shorts aren't by other shorts. They're not even by the pants. And so for students with word retrieval difficulty, this is often kind of how their vocabulary might be stored. So for example, I might store a word, for example, volcano with another similar word like mountain or earthquake, right? So I'm kind of categorizing it. I might also store words based on synonyms. So I might store my word happy next to my word joyful. And so when I go to retrieve a word, it's organized. I know where to find it. It's by other similar words, and then I can retrieve it and say it quickly. Versus a student where that's not their organization system and it's kind of messy, it's going to take them longer to retrieve the specific word they're looking for. In addition to organization, working memory is also important in this skill. Students need to, first of all, keep the word in their memory while they're looking for it. They also need to keep the topic of conversation in their head, the sentence they were saying, as they're finding that word. So they're having to keep the information of the conversation, keep the target idea of the word in their head while they retrieve it. And that can be difficult for students that have that limited working memory capacity. Here are a couple examples of students who have word retrieval difficulty. So on the left, Brian, a second grader, was trying to find the word ornament and say it. And he said, I know it, it's a, and he really just couldn't get there. So we know that Brian knows what an ornament is. He has seen an ornament, he's spoken the word ornament before. It's not that he doesn't know it, it's just that he couldn't retrieve it. And then his examiner said, he's very aware of the mismatch between the words he verbalizes and the thoughts he wants to express. He's unable to prevent his word finding errors. So this student, Brian, he knows that he has such good thoughts, and he realizes that when he verbalizes it, it's not quite what he was thinking. And that can kind of come across as frustration in some students. That's a frustrating feeling, not being able to clearly find your specific words and explain yourself. The one on the right here, the older student, Jose, in 9th grade, he was explaining in class how he feels. He says, I hate Mr. Phillips' class. When he starts questioning, I hide my book and I say, I hope he doesn't call on me. Then when someone else answers, I think, I knew that. So that's really important too, to think, how are these students feeling in class? So, we need to, as if there's any teachers in the audience tonight, how can we make our students successful? And we have some information on that in a little bit. And it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of these students, again, they know the information, they know the words. And so really helping them get the information out so they can share their knowledge is important. Okay.
That was neat. I want to add one quick thing.
Yeah.
A lot of times students with word retrieval difficulties will give really short answers, and even in social situations. So if it's like, how was your day? How was school? Fine, good, I don't know. And it's not always, sometimes it's that they're giving you attitude as a parent because they just don't want to talk about school. But sometimes it's that it is so effortful for them all day long in school to be focusing on language and expressing themselves and understanding that it's just like too much to try to put all their thoughts together. So if that's the case, sometimes asking more specific questions like, who'd you sit by at lunch? How was music class today? What project are you working on in XYZ class will be a more successful way than such a big open-ended idea like, how was your day at school? Because that's a lot of information to kind of parse down and figure out, what do I talk about? What do I not talk about? Stuff like that. The other thing to think about is we really need to pay attention to, is the student having trouble with word retrieval, or are they having trouble with comprehension? Because a lot of times we've assessed so many kids that have come in whose teachers or parents or other professionals feel like they have a comprehension deficit, when really what we find is they're understanding the information, but they're having a really hard time producing answers to open-ended questions or writing an essay. So it looks like they must not have understood the story. They must not understand this topic, when really it's more about organizing their thoughts and finding their words to explain what they know.
Yeah, but we're going to go into more of like how to help with that as a teacher and parent. Okay, here's another example, a little longer one, of what it may sound like or look like to have a student with word retrieval difficulty tell you a story. So This was one of our assessments we did with a elementary school student. The examiner asked or told them, tell me a story about a time when you made something. The student said, I made a present for my mom for Mother's Day. Is there anything else you want to tell me about that? Student says no. So again, what Meghan was mentioning, some short responses, they might need some closed-ended questions or some prompting. So this examiner asked, what did you make? Student says it was a thing where it had like, well, it wasn't, well, I kind of forgot, but I knew that I made it. And it was something about like, I don't really remember that much about it. I just know that I made it because I know that I made it because I wrote it on a piece of paper that I had something for my mom for Mother's Day. So if we look at that story, that quote, it looks pretty long, like a pretty good response, but there really isn't much content to it. There's a lot of vague words like it was a thing. There's a lot of pauses you can see with the ... There's revisions, there's abandoned utterances, really empty, non-specific words. And so the student was really struggling to retrieve specific words and then organize those words to clearly explain himself. He definitely knew what he made his mom. He definitely had something in his mind that he was trying to describe, but he couldn't quite get there.
Okay, another component of spoken language that's highly affected by executive functioning. Well, I see there's 3 chats. Are there questions right now about word retrieval that we can answer?
Yeah, there is one question. Dylan was wondering, to what degree is it appropriate to feed vocabulary options to a child experiencing that frustrating gap between idea and spoken word?
That's a great question. It definitely is going to depend on the context. I would say if you are a parent and you're trying to converse with your student and you're seeing that frustration, giving choices is going to be huge. Did it happen in music class or at recess? Was it with this friend or was it with this friend? Was it this movie or this movie? Especially, you know your kids, you know what they like. And so if you are having a hunch as to what they're trying to get at and can offer them choices, that's definitely a great strategy. It might be different if it's an assessment though, right? Like it's hard to figure out, do I give you the word because you're just having a hard time thinking of the word, or is that giving you the answer? So you have to think about the context. You have to think about the student specifically. What do you know about that student? But definitely an accommodation that we talk about a lot, which we will get into some different strategies and accommodations. But one of them is, if there's a student that struggles with word retrieval, a better way to assess them might be to give them choices, true, false, matching, multiple choice, sentence completion, where you're giving them a beginning of the sentence and they're filling in a blank. All of those are going to help the student get their ideas out. And then the other thing is, we want to give them those strategies, but we also want them to be working with people to help them with that word retrieval so they can improve those skills. So we want to kind of do a balance of both offering that support and helping them improve their skills. Okay, so I'm going to dive into listening comprehension. This is another piece of spoken language that is affected by executive functioning. Obviously, we need to comprehend language all day, every day, academic settings, social settings. We need to be able to comprehend facts. We need to be able to make inferences when all the information isn't stated. And we need to be able to monitor ourselves and say, hold on, I didn't really understand that. I need to ask a question, or I need to ask them to repeat that. Students with ADHD are often, and most of the time, able to comprehend facts at the same level as their peers, but they have much more difficulty with the inferencing and the self-monitoring. So if they aren't keeping their focus, or they can't control their impulses to pay attention to distractions, they're going to have a harder time picking up on those subtle context clues or nonverbal clues, body language, to be able to make those inferences. And they also may not be paying attention to the information close enough to say, oh, hold on, I missed that, I need to go back, or I didn't understand that. That's much harder for them. So why do students with ADHD or other executive functioning difficulties have trouble with listening comprehension? The 3 big ones are working memory. Oftentimes students have more trouble with verbal working memory than visual. So if we're just listening to information and we're not seeing anything associated with it, it's really hard to attend to that information. So a lot of these students might benefit from visuals, even if it's like they're listening to a book, but they're following along. That's going to help them focus. They're getting it through multiple modalities. The other thing that affects listening comprehension, I just kind of mentioned, is attention and impulse control. If you're not attending to something you're listening to, it's not going to get encoded into your memory. So a lot of these students with difficulty with executive functioning, it's not that they're not smart enough to learn the information. It's that if they cannot monitor or keep their focus in class, the information isn't even getting into their brain to a point where they can process it and remember it later. And then flexibility is sometimes something that's hard for students. And this comes into play when maybe somebody's using sarcasm or there's multiple meanings of the same word. We have to be flexible and be able to interpret something multiple different ways or think about something from another person's perspective in order to comprehend. Questions about listening comprehension before I get into narrative language?
There's one question that's more about techniques to help students with their word retrieval skills, but maybe that's something you'll go into.
Yep, we'll go into that in a little bit. Hang tight. Narrative language is another piece of spoken language. So this is a more expressive piece. Listening is obviously more comprehension. So narrative language is think about storytelling. So it's your ability to talk about an experience you had or summarize a story you read or talk about a movie that you saw. It's more structured than just, hey, how's the weather? Casual conversation, but it's not as structured as like a novel or a written essay or a speech that you're giving, for instance. This is something we want to assess in our younger kiddos because it's found to be a significant predictor for success in school. If kiddos are having a hard time, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, telling stories, retelling a story, talking about their personal experiences, that's an indicator to us that we need to pay attention to their language, pay attention to their reading and writing, and make sure that they are up to speed so that they can continue to succeed in school. Most narratives have a really specific pattern to them. There's characters, there's a setting, there's usually some type of conflict or problem, there's emotions expressed, there's a resolution, there's an ending, and kids start to pick up on that pattern kind of intuitively the more they read or the more they listen to stories. A lot of students that have trouble with reading and writing have trouble with narrative language, and a lot of students who have trouble with attention and executive functioning have trouble with narrative language, because if you think about a story, it has to be organized and planned. The events need to be sequenced. We need to pay attention to details. We need to leave out details that don't matter. And so that's a lot of information to pay attention to at one time. So narrative language is kind of a catch-all. It's all the different language and executive functioning skills at once. Narrative language can be both telling a story, but also taking in a story. So if we think about listening to a story and all the different things we need to do while we're listening to a story, we need to be able to follow the story structure. We need to take in context clues so that we can make predictions, make inferences. Stories are often how we learn about cause and effect. It's often how we learn about different emotional words and adjectives. So getting kids really familiar with and practicing storytelling and narrative language really helps to solidify that framework in their mind and make it more and more automatic for them to be able to tell stories successfully as well. I already covered some of these. I'm getting ahead of myself in my notes and then I get to the slide, but telling a narrative requires all these different skills: sequencing, which is planning and organizing, working memory, and then more language skills like grammar and vocabulary. They need to, one of the things that I notice a lot with kids that have trouble with narrative language is they don't totally provide enough context for the listener. So a lot of times you'll get a really vague story, or they'll be referring to a person you've never heard of, or it's really hard to follow because it's totally out of order. And then it also requires pragmatic skills like staying on topic and paying attention to your listener and providing information about how the character might be feeling. So I'm going to give you an example. Sorry,
one quick thing I was going to add, yeah. So when you were mentioning that oftentimes students will leave out setting or context and leaves the listener really confused, that's that metacognition skill, right? Self-evaluating. Did I include enough information? Does my listener look confused? And kind of self-questioning, making sure that you are making sense to your listener.
That's a perfect lead into this example of narrative language. This was an actual assessment that I think Jeannie did. And this was a student that did not provide us enough context. And it was a little bit alarming until we found out who Norm was. Sorry. So it says, I was watching my show, my mom was cooking, Norm jumped on the counter, grabbed a knife, tried to play around with it. Then we figured out that Norm is the dog in the story, but providing names with no reference to who they are, you can see that there's jumping around in this story. There are some revisions or restarts, and there's a lot of information where it's, if you read through the whole thing, it's pretty hard to follow as an unfamiliar list. But this came from an 11-year-old boy who has ADHD and learning disorders. You can tell it's disorganized. He abandoned some utterances. There's not enough context. And again, we totally didn't know who Norm was first, which was a little bit off-putting.
Okay, any questions about narrative language before we move on to social impact? And then we are going to move on to some more accommodations to help with this, and we can briefly discuss some interventions too.
All right, well then I think we're good for now.
Okay, great. Okay, so the final spoken language area that we're going to go over is the social impact. And so when we think about social communication skills, I have a whole list up here. So tone of voice, the volume of our voice, taking perspectives of others, communicating our emotions appropriately, taking turns in conversation, understanding nonverbal cues like eye contact, body language, using your own body language and facial expressions as well. So there's a lot that goes into that. See if I can go to the next slide. Ooh, there we go. Oops, go back one. Okay. So in social communication, you can see that a lot of executive functioning skills are needed. So you need response inhibition. And so if we look at the right-hand box, students with executive functioning deficits, they may say the first thing that comes to their mind, or they may interrupt, right? And so that's that response inhibition piece. They're struggling to pause and think and identify, is this a good time to chime in, or would that be rude because I'd be interrupting someone? They're maybe not thinking about their comment. Would this be helpful if I said this, or would this hurt their feelings? So they might be just blurting things out. They might ask for repetitions because maybe they're struggling with that attention piece, or maybe they're struggling with that working memory piece. So maybe a friend is telling them a longer story and then asking them a question. That's a lot to keep in their working memory. And so they might say things like, wait, what did you say? Can you say that again? This might frustrate their peers too. So if they're not, inhibiting their responses and blurting things out, interrupting, if they're not paying attention to their friends, if they're not being flexible in the conversation and switching topics when the friend wants to, if they're having poor self-control, this can frustrate peers. So that's what this might look like in students with ADHD or executive functioning deficits. Okay, so Meghan jumped in earlier and kind of explained a lot of these really well. So I won't spend a ton of time going through these, but really briefly, what can we do at school and at home to support these students that struggle with this? So students that really struggle with working memory, understanding of language are going to benefit from written copies of notes, especially those older students that are in more of those lecture-based classes in high school and in college. It's hard for them to maybe understand or to keep this information in their working memory. So having those notes is going to be helpful. For the younger students, having visuals of the instructions, especially if they're more than 1 or 2 steps, having pictures or words for the older students is going to be really nice. For that word retrieval, giving wait time for students when they're responding. So if you call on a student in class and they're not giving you an answer right away, don't assume right away that they don't know the answer. Give them a little bit of time. And then if given time they're still struggling, then you can kind of implement some of the things Meghan was sharing earlier. So closed-ended questions, giving them a sentence starter, giving them a couple options to choose from. And then another good idea for students that struggle with that understanding piece, that working memory piece, is having students repeat the directions aloud back to you or have them tell you their plan. And that really checks for comprehension, and having them explain it out loud can really help them kind of process it. In terms of intervention, I would say, if these accommodations and modifications aren't really enough, or a student is really having more significant needs, or is struggling with a lot of the things we just talked about, I would recommend getting a speech and language evaluation to see, if these difficulties rise to the need of speech language intervention. And then we have various interventions that we do. So for example, for word retrieval, we'll help students kind of make connections with known words or known concepts, so that they're kind of learning to store the vocabulary and concepts in an organized fashion, so that when they go to retrieve it, it's easier, it's quicker. For narratives, we have different curriculum where there's visuals, there's different visuals that we use to kind of follow structure. And so that would really be time to consult with a speech language pathologist.
A couple other things. For the students that are having a lot of difficulty that work with a speech language pathologist, we are doing a lot of different like word mapping, categorizing, and then we're also to help them organize, but we're also teaching them describing skills as a compensatory strategy. If they can't think of the word, they can give you like, it's that animal, it's really slow, it has a shell, I can't think of the word. Someone else can say, oh, you mean a turtle, versus them saying, oh, it's that thing, the thing. So teaching them those describing skills is sometimes helpful too. And we do that in the game context, which kids really like. So any type of like guessing games where one person's describing and the other person is guessing are really great. In terms of in class for teachers, for students that have trouble with word retrieval, another thing you could think about, which takes planning, is if you've got a student that you want to be able to participate more, seems to be having this trouble, if you can give them a question that you are going to ask them. So in a few minutes, we're going to be talking as a class about this topic. This is the question I'm going to ask you, so that they have some time to think about it and prepare for that question. That can be helpful as well. I'm seeing more questions pop up. What other questions can we answer before we move on to writing?
Sure. I think you kind of addressed this one. Tiffany is wondering, is it a good strategy for some kids to give them answers to the questions before the unit begins, to give them a reference point for the information they will be learning and expected to retrieve later? So kind of like what you were just saying, we're giving the question ahead of time, but also she's wondering about the answer portion, so they know what they're expecting.
Well, that's a tricky one too, because we want to balance like giving them the words they need to be able to participate while also teaching them the topic and the problem solving and the critical thinking of learning the information. But we are going to talk a little bit later when we get into reading and writing about ways that you can prime kids, especially before reading and writing on a new topic, by either having them watch videos or look at pictures or read a more simple storybook about the unit or the information, so that they've got some pictures in their mind of exactly what we're talking about. Maybe expose them to some of the vocabulary words that are new before you start. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to when you're saying like the answers, but definitely priming kids by giving them some introduction to the topic and some background information is definitely helpful.
And then we just have one other question. Andrea is wondering, can spoken language deficits look or present like autism?
I would say that spoken language deficits can be a component of autism. So I used to work with students with autism exclusively. I'm familiar with the population. There are a lot of students with autism who have difficulty with spoken language. And there are a lot of students with ADHD who have trouble with social communication. So I would say the difference is there between just the language piece and something more that looks like autism is also going to come with some restricted or repetitive behaviors, some lack of skill versus, so for instance, a lot of kids with ADHD, if we can regulate their attention and help them with the executive functioning, then they know how to socialize. Kids with autism still may have trouble with that, even if they are totally attending to the situation or really tuned into what's going on. So I would say it's definitely can be something that students with autism struggle with, but if the only thing we're seeing is the language and the difficulty with word retrieval, that wouldn't be like the main marker of autism spectrum disorder.
All right, well, that was all the questions we have right now.
Great.
Awesome.
Okay, we're going to move into executive functioning and writing next. This is a really interesting quote. I'm not going to read it all, but I encourage you to read it after. It just explains how complex writing is and all of the executive functionings that go into it. So I bolded all of the ones that I saw. So there's, you have to inhibit your distractions. You have to sustain your attention on the task, plan what to write, organize your ideas, be flexible if you need to edit. And then the last sentence that's bolded is kind of explaining working memory. So keeping these things in your mind while you translate them. So, you know, as you can see, there's so much going on and it might come super naturally and easily to a lot of us, but students with these executive functioning deficits, it's very complex. And so we need to kind of put in some support for those students. So if you work with younger students, you might not see executive functioning deficits really playing a huge role in writing, because when we're younger, we're really focusing on transcription, transcribing the words, writing like the lines and the circles and kind of putting the letters together then to make a word. And it doesn't really put a huge, it doesn't really impact your executive functioning skills a whole ton. But as students get older, the focus switches more from just that transcription of a word or a sentence to developing ideas, organizing our thoughts, making sure it makes sense to the reader, editing. And so executive functioning skills really do then play a much bigger role. So that as students progress through later elementary, middle, high school, you're going to see, and we often see this at Grove's Learning Organization too, students that are older and are finally kind of realizing or getting, you know, these assessments like, okay, maybe something's going on with executive functioning. As they're getting older, the demands are increasing, and we're able to see that now. Okay, so to write, you need almost all the executive functioning skills. These 8 are the major 8, the top 8 that you would need. And I'm going to go into depth on the more confusing ones or the more complex ones. So we're going to start with working memory. So working memory is the most critical executive functioning skill to be a successful writer. So again, working memory is keeping information in your head, manipulating it, and then kind of regurgitating it and kind of using it. And so when we think about this, when we're writing, we need to recall spelling rules. We need to recall our sentence structures that we know. We have to recall and keep in our working memory all the punctuation rules. Then we also have to recall prior knowledge and keep those facts in our head as we're writing. Then we need to select our ideas. Well, those in our memory, we need to kind of say the sentence in our head that we want to write. Then we need to write it down and keep all of this in our working memory. So the students that have, you know, that limited working memory capacity are really at a disadvantage here. There's a lot that we have to keep in our working memory. So what does this look like in students? So students may forget what they were writing in the middle of the sentence. So they may kind of write half of the sentence and then forget their train of thought because they were having trouble keeping that in their working memory. As they're maybe making an outline, they might be forgetting ideas that they had said out loud previously. And then it's going to take them more time to then go back, recall, reprocess, and replan. So it can often take students a lot longer to write as well. Additionally, difficulty with higher level writing skills is often common, like I was saying earlier, so that idea generation is difficult, organization, and that leads to just overall less interesting and less complex writing because they're really focusing that working memory on those lower level skills like punctuation and spelling. Okay, planning and prioritizing, that's super important in writing too. This one's a little more obvious, but overall, we have to plan out each sentence, right? We have to plan out what we want to say in our head. We have to then write it out. We have to plan our structure of our paragraph. And also we have to prioritize what is the most important and what are small details we don't really need to include. And so with students, this might look like they might skip the brainstorming and the planning and outlining process totally. And so that will maybe lead to shorter paragraphs or choppy sentences or choppy paragraphs, not really much flow if they don't take that time to plan. They also might include too many specific details versus looking at like that bigger picture and the main idea and prioritizing what to include. Organization is our next one. So when we write, we have to organize our ideas in the correct sequence. I was just working with a student the other day and he was writing a paragraph about wolves in Yellowstone National Park, and he had 1973 and then he jumped to 1995 and then he jumped back to 1974. And so we kind of talked through, okay, how would we better organize and sequence this? Also organizing sentences to be grammatically correct, have accurate sentence structure. And then something else too to think about is organizing physical and online resources. So as we get older, as students get older, they have to access their notes, they have to access maybe articles online, their textbook, and they have to be able to organize that and know where these items are, where these sections are to really use them efficiently. So difficulty in organization might look like sentences being out of order, maybe there's sentence structure errors, probably jumping around a lot, it might be hard to follow. So here, I have an example here. This was a student I evaluated a few years ago. He was in 9th grade. He really struggled with planning and attention. Specifically, attention was really tough for him. I had him write a paragraph about himself as I was assessing him, and he wrote this down. He wrote, I like music, art, and painting. I like sport cars, racing, eating good food, trying new things, eating, have fun, watch movies, games. So we're seeing here that it's very brief, very short. It jumps around. It doesn't make a whole ton of sense. His sentences aren't correct grammatically. They're not organized appropriately. And he's kind of repeating different things. He said eating twice. And the student was looking up about every 30 seconds to ask me a question or to tell me a story. And so that attention really impacted him too. He wasn't able to attend to really finish a full sentence. And his sentences ended up being very simple or inaccurate or fragments. Here's an example of a 4th grade student I evaluated who had difficulty with organizing and planning. I had her just kind of write me a story about a recent event that happened to her. And she wrote, I was dizzy. I don't know what was going on. Then that morning, I was so excited to go to my cousin's house. When we got there, we played a game. Then I did a cartwheel down the stairs. And so this is out of order here. She's struggling with sequencing. She put the ending, I was dizzy, at the beginning instead of the end. So she did a cartwheel down the stairs, hit her head, and was dizzy. So she had difficulty kind of sequencing and making sure the story made total sense, and difficulty kind of planning it out ahead of time. Okay, flexibility. So again, this is that ability to adapt to change, to go with the flow when things need to change. And so this, we see this a lot in like that editing and revising part of writing. So we need to be flexible when we accept feedback from teachers and from others if we're doing peer reviews. We need to keep our audience in mind and be flexible with that too. If we're writing to our senator versus if we're writing a letter to our grandma, we're gonna have to be flexible in the way we word things and adjust our writing if it's needed. Also, making sure to follow instructions for written assignments, even if they're not ideal. So if the teacher is asking me to write a paper about wolves, but I don't like wolves and I want to write about whales, that's not the assignment. I have to accept that. So what does this look like? Students might not take feedback or criticism well. They may even get a little emotional about this, having to revise and edit. They may really like it the way it is. And so Megan and I, in our sessions, we have conversations with students, about this. Teachers are here to help you grow. That's our job. We're just doing this to help, and we kind of walk through students too with how we can be more flexible.
One other thing that comes into play with flexibility that I've seen too is, and sometimes it's also difficulty with just the language and the sentence structure skills. But if we see kids wording sentences the same way, like they're using the same sentence starter every time, or they're not varying their vocabulary, they're using the same word repetitively, that could be a sign of difficulty with flexibility and thinking about what's another way that I could say this? What's another way I could describe this? Or how else could I start a sentence besides this one way that I've been using?
Absolutely. And that kind of goes with metacognition too. So again, this is being able to take that bird's eye view of yourself, your actions and your work, and kind of self-question. And so if the student is, going through their work and editing and revising, maybe they're not realizing that they're using the same word over and over or using that same sentence structure. But to back up a little bit, the role of metacognition in writing. So again, taking that bird's eye view, you have to be aware of the resources you have, aware of the strategies that you may have learned in school recently to use, keeping your audience in mind again, reflecting on prior work, feedback, and mistakes. So kind of taking that information from teachers or from test grades and really applying that to your new work can be difficult. And then again, that editing and revising can be tough because they might struggle to self-question and self-reflect. So they might not be asking themselves, like, what should I change? What grade would I give myself? Did I even follow the prompt? Did I follow the direction? So that might be tricky. So this might look like difficulty detecting and correcting errors. They might be unaware of different strategies that they've learned or resources that they have. They might have trouble thinking about that audience, like I was saying, in flexibility, and then difficulty, again, learning from those past reading mistakes and applying what they've learned.
One thing I've experienced with students that's kind of related to the metacognition and the editing and revising piece is that a lot of times they just aren't doing that piece. They finish a writing assignment because they are done with it. It took them forever. A lot of times it's hard and they are done. So sometimes it is just walking through that process with the student, bringing them awareness to it, reading it sentence by sentence. And a lot of times, if they will participate in that process with me and we break it down sentence by sentence, they can find those mistakes on their own. So that shows us that it really is the metacognition skill of remembering to self-reflect. What questions should I be asking myself? Going through it slowly. It's not necessarily that they don't know those grammar rules or know how to spell that word, because when we guide them through breaking it down, a lot of times they can catch their own errors.
Okay, so how do we help? So unfortunately, this presentation, we don't have a ton of time to go into interventions because it really is how does executive functioning affect the reading, writing, and spoken language, but we do want to provide you with some intervention. So we're briefly going to go over that. And so the research shows that in order to help students with ADHD, executive functioning deficits, improve their writing, it's really important to have repeated, explicit instructions in the writing process. And we know that this happens at school. However, these students need more than just those typical students. Those typical students might catch on a little easier because they do have those executive functioning skills. They're more advanced. So we really need to repeat, provide these visuals, provide these resources that or these graphic organizers that they're using, and really teach them explicitly over and over. This will eventually lead to reducing their load of their working memory and other executive functioning skills, because it will become automatic over time. They won't have to be kind of having all of this work on their executive functioning. And then guided feedback from a clinician or teacher, as Megan was saying earlier, really kind of going through together, reading sentences out loud, giving them feedback in the moment, one-on-one. And I have a slide on that in a little bit too that goes into more depth.
Really quick, going back to that working memory piece. So with the working memory, when a student is first learning to write, they are both having to think about organizing, planning, sentence structure, grammar, along with their ideas for this particular topic or information that they want to present or information that they're reading about. And as we make the structure, the organization, the planning, the grammar more automatic, the more they can think about the content of what they're writing and the ideas and the information that they want to present. So that's what we mean by taking the load off of the working memory and the executive functioning by giving lots and lots and lots of repetition.
Okay, so more specifically, how do we kind of give this intervention? So it's really important to start at the sentence level. And so teaching specific strategies that students can then pull from is going to be really important, and specifically to target the complex sentences. So why does this benefit them? It helps them with organizing and planning their sentences if they can kind of go to a strategy. It gives the students super clear steps to follow. And students with executive functioning deficits really benefit from that, having those clear steps. Again, like Megan was saying, it takes the load off of the working memory, so they don't have to like remember, different rules for sentences. They can really just kind of go to certain strategies. And then it will overall eventually lead to improved efficiency while writing. So that will improve their time management if they're able to kind of beef up these skills. At GLO, or Groves Learning Organization, we use the Writing Revolution curriculum in all of our divisions at the school. And then we also use it in speech language therapy with our students. And so this curriculum is amazing. It really makes things simplified for these students. They don't use very complex vocabulary like predicate or different vocabulary terms that are tricky for kids to learn. They use more basic terms like a sentence needs a who and it needs a did what, right? So Megan went to the store. And so that's really cool and has been really helpful for our students. Some examples of activities are down in the left box here. So turning fragments into sentences, combining sentences is a great one, expanding sentences by adding WH information. So for example, if I had a short sentence like Megan went to the store, I would prompt a student to, maybe you could add when it was, or why she went, or how she went. Did she go quickly? Did she go slowly? Using different conjunctions. And there's more here. The website's here if you want to check it out. And then also there is the Writing Revolution book on Amazon, and it's really affordable if you are interested in taking a deeper look. I have a couple examples on this slide. So the one on the left here is combining sentences. So there's two sentences here, and the student is expected then to combine them and rewrite the sentence. And then over here is a sentence expansion, but we are running low on time, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. Okay, so that's at the sentence level. At the paragraph level, how do we help? Again, just that repeated instruction on that writing process. So modeling and teaching brainstorming is really important. This is where a lot of our students get stuck, that task initiation piece. They're like, I don't know where to start. I don't know how to start this assignment. I don't know how to start this paper. So what we do with them is we really model that brainstorming. So, okay, if the topic is your favorite holiday, let's first pick a holiday and then think about all the things that come to our mind. When I think of Christmas, that's my favorite holiday. What comes to my mind? Let's write them all down. So we really model that for them and they join in. And then the next step is really to categorize the ideas. And so students, again, with executive functioning deficits are really struggling with organizing, planning, those papers out. So if we can help them kind of categorize similar ideas that they've brainstormed, then that can kind of help them know what to put in each paragraph or each section of their paragraph. And so in this visual, you can see that this was Megan's student, they highlighted.
Yes,
What'd you say?
I was just going to explain. So this kid got to play flag football at US Bank Stadium. So he was writing about that experience. And so one of the categories was specifically about the stadium. One of them was about who was there watching. One of them was about the actual flag football game, getting an interception, getting some flags, beating the other team. One of them was about foods he got to eat. And then one of them was about watching his brother play. And so we were able to organize those ideas into kind of different categories for him.
Yeah. All right. So then once you do that, we teach students then to take those highlighted categories and put it into an outline. And so this is just a very simple single paragraph outline that we use from the Writing Revolution. It has the topic sentence, 4 detail areas, and a conclusion sentence. And outlines, obviously, they really help with organization, right? It helps kids visualize and organize their ideas. And then, as you can see, again, like I said, you take the colors from that categorized brainstorm sheet and you kind of copy them onto the outline. And it really helps them then be able to kind of transfer the information. Outlines help with working memory. We can't keep all of these ideas in our memory at once. We need to kind of get them on paper, and having them written down in note form is super helpful. And this obviously helps with planning as well. Okay, editing and revising. So earlier Megan was explaining this, but for students, she was saying they often do skip over that editing and revising step. They just want to turn it in and get it done, right? They just are oftentimes students with executive functioning deficits will rush through things and wanting to get it done as quickly as possible. So we need to really explicitly teach them how to edit and revise. And so what I often do in my sessions is I read each sentence aloud. I'll pause after each sentence and we discuss. And I'm like, okay, do you hear any mistakes? And oftentimes they do. And if they don't, I will kind of point it out and kind of prompt them and see if they can figure it out. I model it all the time. Maybe I'll edit a sentence and then have them edit the next one. Providing them with revision and editing checklists can be helpful. However, we can't just give them the checklist. We have to show them how to use it and do it with them again repeatedly for them to kind of start using it on their own. If they don't have a person there to read sentences aloud to them, you're having them use text to speech. So having the computer read the sentences aloud can be helpful because they'll be able to hear those errors. And then repeat. So that repeated instruction is super important.
And then as kids get more familiar with writing strategies and with editing and revising, I will also, at the beginning of editing, I'll say, okay, we're going to go through sentence by sentence. What should we be looking for? And then I'll make a list with them either on our whiteboard or on a piece of paper. And they'll usually give me capital letters, punctuation, spelling. And then we usually have to prompt for, we should also look for where we can add more details or what kind of vocabulary we can use, things like that.
Yes, and then Megan, you were gonna, this is our last rating slide, then we'll check questions. Megan was, or no, I'm gonna do this slide and then you're gonna do the next one, okay. So this is something else that's a really cool tool to help students with like planning, time management, organizing, metacognition. So this is like a backwards planning sheet. It's from Sarah Ward, or it's kind of her original creation. So what we do with this sheet, I'll try to explain it briefly. We start over here on the right with the done column. It says number 1, this is what you start with. You see ahead. So what you're going to do is you're going to visualize the future of your paragraph or of your paper. So the student's going to be like, okay, what is my paper supposed to look like? And they'll sketch it out. They won't actually write words here. They'll just kind of like scribble, but it shows that it's indented. It shows that there's a title. It shows that there's names and dates over here. And it kind of, you can scribble like the length it needs to be too. From there, the student then goes to this column, the do column, and it says, break it down, plan it out. What steps do I take? And so this is the column where you write down like, okay, first I need to brainstorm. Then I need to sort my ideas. Then I need to put it in the outline, right? Then I need to edit X, Y, Z. So you write down, have the student, and you have to definitely walk the student through this multiple times before they use this on their own. But then they write down all the steps of the writing process. Then they get ready. You make a list of all the materials they'll need. Then you go to number 4, you gather all of the materials. Then you go to number 5, you use a clock. There's something called the working clock that we won't get into right now, but basically some like managing time, right? So estimating how long it will take, maybe drawing on a clock or setting a timer of some sort to make sure that they are managing their time okay, make sure they're not rushing, make sure that they're staying on task. So that clock can help with that. And then once you're done with all of the steps, then you check back. Does my final product look like I thought it would? And this is where I often catch students being like, oh, I forgot to indent, or, oh no, I don't have a title. So this can be really helpful. It supports so many executive functioning skills. And this is something you don't need the specific sheet to do this. You could just do it on your whiteboard. You could just do it on a piece of blank paper, just kind of drawing out the outcome, listing the steps, listing the materials. And here is a picture of a student that Megan was working with using, like putting all of the things together that I just mentioned. So Megan, you want to explain?
Yeah, so backwards planning is something that can be used with any type of project or any type of task. And so I typically introduce it by working on something like hands-on so that they can get used to the process, and then we translate it to writing. But you can see this is a totally candid photo. I know it looks like I made the student pose for this photo, but this was actually us working. She didn't even know I was taking this photo, and I was just having this really proud moment of what she was doing with all of our strategies. So you can see on that little whiteboard that's on the left, but it's on her right, is where she sketched out that she was going to be writing a paragraph. She listed out the steps she needed to do, which started with read through and organize our notes, categorize them, put them on an outline. And then she listed out all the materials she was going to need. So what I like to do is I say, we're going to plan backwards and work forwards, or we're going to plan our work and then work our plan. So she did her planning, and then we followed her plan by categorizing our notes. And then you can see we got them on the outline. She's got her colors, she's writing her concluding sentence, and that will turn into a paragraph. So you can kind of use all these tools together.
Okay. Do you want to, okay, I'll do this slide and then we'll do questions. All right, so some accommodations and modifications that we can put in place for students that have difficulty with writing due to executive functioning, reducing length of written assignments, extending time, breaking down the writing task and helping them break it down and know how, helping the student make personal due dates. So maybe like by Monday, they want their outline done, by Tuesday, they want their first draft, and kind of helping them stick with that. Removing obvious ones like removing distractions, building and breaks. This one's really important, the second to last one, allowing access to outlines, giving them the repeated direct instruction, but also making sure that that teachers and providers are kind of using the same or similar resources, so that the student, because sometimes students will use something in their reading class, and then when they go to science class, they're not sure that they can generalize that and take it to both classes. So making sure providers and teachers are kind of using something similar with the student. Okay, so questions about writing. I answered one in the Q&A. Is there others?
Yeah, there was just one other, excuse me, talking about a few slides back. Somebody was wondering about the timing of how often to review and work on the repetition, whether it's language or math facts, for short periods of time over several days, or is it like a weekly thing? Like what timing would you recommend when working with your student?
So I would say in general, with any skill, you want to be practicing things often in order to keep them top of mind, make things more automatic. So there is something called the curve of forgetting that tells us that it's better to review something every day for 10 minutes than to not review it at all and then do it for an hour at the end of the week. With writing, it's not that simple. It's going to be something like, for instance, I typically, when I'm working with my students one-on-one, which I recognize is not what everybody is doing, we're writing a paragraph every 1 to 3 sessions. So we're reading about something, we're taking notes, we're organizing those notes, we're putting them in an outline, we're turning that into a paragraph, and we're editing and revising. And typically it takes us 2 to 3 sessions to get through all of those steps. And then we're doing that process repeatedly until they become more and more independent. So the first time they're doing it with a lot of support. And by the end, I'm able to say things like, okay, now it's time to set up our outline. Set up your outline and I'll look at it when you're finished. So there's not a formula like you need to practice writing every single day. The point being, it's just not something that you can practice 1 time or 2 times and then expect them to do it independently.
And then I see another question about how do you get your student to not want to get up several times during a work session? This is definitely dependent on a student. So, depending on their age, maybe you build in those breaks. Maybe you have them work for a reward. We often will color on clocks to show, like, once the minute hand is at the end of the purple, like that's when we can take that break. And so if you kind of, with these students with executive functioning deficits, breaks are good. And so you want to build them, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for them to get up and have some movement. And so just kind of having them have more scheduled breaks though, is what really helps me, or building in something fun at the end of a session to look forward to. We play a lot of short, fun games, language games, that can really help in sessions.
Yeah, I would say the goal isn't to avoid taking breaks for sure, but it's also about teaching kids like when is a good time to take a break, when is not a good time, how long should a break be, how do we get back on task after a break. And a lot of our students that we're working with, we are teaching language skills and executive functioning skills. So we're teaching a lot of that self-awareness and learning about the brain, learning about executive functioning. And we actually teach them to advocate by asking for a break, by looking for signs in their body that they're feeling restless or their brain's not focused. And then we want to encourage them to advocate for that, of course, within reason. It's also okay to say, you just had a break 2 minutes ago. We're going to do a little more work. Okay, we're going to get into reading. We have until 8:30. We're probably going to go right up until 8:30. These are all the different executive functioning skills that go into reading. Is there one more question that popped up that I should answer before we get into reading?
I can type answers to them while you're presenting.
Okay, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
You can also, you guys, like I said at the beginning, Jeannie and I, this is our bread and butter. We could talk about this for days. So if there's stuff that you're thinking about or that you're really hungry for that we aren't answering today, send us an email and we'll do our best to answer it. Okay, so executive functioning and reading. Again, just like writing, reading requires a lot of executive functioning skills and a lot of self-monitoring. So we need response inhibition to be able to filter out distractions, not pay attention to information that's not relevant. I'm going to go into working memory in a lot more detail on the next slide, so hold tight on that one. Emotional control. For a lot of these kiddos, reading is not fun. It's difficult. It's hard for them to understand what they're reading. It's hard for them to pay attention when they're reading. It's boring. So that's where emotional control comes in. It can be frustrating. It can be hard. And being able to control those emotions. Flexibility comes into play with reading when we're thinking about words that have multiple meanings, non-literal language, trying to think about the character's perspective if the character has a different personality or a different experience than the reader does. Sustained attention. Of course, if you're not attending to what you're reading, you're not going to understand it and you're not going to be able to analyze it and respond to it. We've all had those moments where you've read an entire page and you're like, wow, I was thinking about work and I wasn't paying attention at all. And I have to go back and reread this whole page. A key for that with kids is telling kids that that happens and that that's normal and trying to encourage them to monitor that and check in with themselves after each paragraph or after each page, rather than getting to the end of an entire chapter and then realizing that they weren't attending and that they missed some information. Planning, how much do I need to read tonight? Do I have enough time to get through the material I need to get to tonight? So this is more when reading is an assignment. Goal-directed persistence, again, because reading can be difficult, sticking to the goal of finishing a certain amount, finishing an assignment, finishing a chapter. And then metacognition as you're reading. Am I understanding what's going on? Do I need to go back? Did I miss something? So that's how that plays a role. So working memory is crucial for reading, and it plays a role in a lot of different things. So first of all, we need working memory to just decode single words. When we're decoding, we have to break a word down into its individual sounds. So if it's cat, we have to break it down into cat. And then I need to remember those 3 sounds to be able to blend them together. So just decoding an individual word means you have to remember each sound in order to blend it. We also need working memory to analyze for meaning. So as sentences become longer and more complex, or paragraphs become longer and more complex, we have to remember more information at once while we're also looking at context clues and trying to analyze that for what that information means. We need working memory to be able to create a mental image in our minds while we read. A lot of us do this automatically, but there are so many kids that struggle and don't create images in their mind while they're reading. And that is because in order to do that, you have to attend to the information, read it, analyze it for meaning, create that picture in your mind, and then update that picture as you receive new information, add details to it, or maybe you find out a detail about a character which changes what they look like in your mind. And those of us that don't have difficulty with this, that it happens automatically, it's really mind-boggling to imagine how efficiently and automatically that happens when you really think about all the different steps that it takes to do that. Inferencing requires working memory because we need to pay attention to subtle clues, remember subtle clues from previously, add it to information we're learning now, update what we think is going on based on new information as we receive it. It also requires us to compare what we're reading to our own personal experiences, apply what we've learned from those experiences to the information we're reading in order to make that inference. So it's a lot of remembering information from multiple places. And then of course, answering the comprehension questions. You have to remember the question long enough to be able to go back in the text to find the answer, or to formulate your response. So much working memory goes into reading. Students that have difficulty with processing speed, slower processing speed really exacerbates this, because the longer it takes you to process information, the longer you have to hold it in your mind in order to analyze it and get meaning from it. So students that have difficulty with processing speed and working memory are really at a disadvantage here. Here's an example of how working memory and flexibility can play a role in reading. These two sentences are saying very similar things, but one of them is much longer and more complex sentence structure. So it's a lot more information to remember. And then you have to be flexible to realize that these are two different ways of saying the exact same thing. And so this is where actually the sentence level writing instruction, where we're teaching complex sentences, how to put together, how to break down, how to add to single sentences, is huge, because it actually makes then reading those more complex sentences and interpreting them and processing them more automatic. So actually, one of the best things you can do for reading comprehension for a lot of kiddos is work on that complex sentence structure. There's a huge correlation between sentence structure knowledge and reading comprehension. So what can we do for students that are having trouble with reading? We can expose them to information in other modalities before they start reading about it. So for example, if a student has a lot of trouble with reading, we want to have them, and I mentioned this earlier, watch videos about a topic, look at YouTube videos, look at Google Images, look up feature films, so that they have visuals that they can rely on that aren't visuals they have to make in their own mind, especially when it's new vocabulary and new information. An example I always give, which I don't know why, because I'm not really a history buff, but I always go back to this one. If a student is going to start studying the Revolutionary War and they're reading about it in a textbook with a lot of complex language, maybe they watch The Patriot and see what the people look like, what kind of weapons are they using, what does the setting look like, and then that can help them process the information while they're reading. Giving a lot of instruction in note-taking can be really helpful. We want kids to be taking notes. Teaching students to stop periodically and self-monitor at the end of a page or the end of a paragraph to make sure they're attending and understanding. Teaching them that it's okay to raise their hand and ask for help if they aren't understanding. Don't just try to push through it without. Studying unfamiliar vocabulary ahead of time can be helpful. Using audiobooks or listening to someone read out loud can be huge, because they're getting the information through multiple modalities, listening and seeing it. This helps a lot for students that aren't reading super fluently, because a lot of times when kids aren't reading fluently, they maybe aren't using great inflection, or they're not pausing in the right places because they're just still really focused on decoding those words. So hearing someone else pause or use inflection can kind of help with the processing of those more complex sentence structures. Again, the manipulation of complex sentence structures through some single sentence writing instruction is going to be big. Pairing a simpler fiction text with a similar theme and having them read more of like a narrative before getting into like a textbook reading can be helpful. And then there's a really great program that we're trained in that we use with a lot of our students called Visualizing and Verbalizing, which teaches them to create pictures in their mind while they're reading, and then also be able to describe and summarize. So that can be a really helpful program. I'm just going to go through some examples of some different visuals we sometimes use with note taking. So we teach kids explicitly, which this seems obvious if you're someone that's been taking notes your whole life, but we teach kids explicitly how to use different symbols and how to use different abbreviations rather than full words. And we have to teach them how to not use full sentences and to use shorthand in order to take really effective notes. This is a writing revolution activity where you can convert full sentences into notes so they can practice using some of those abbreviations and symbols. So here's the answer key. And so it's giving a kid a full sentence and then asking them to break it down and use their visual to turn it into notes. You can also give them notes and have them convert it into full sentences. You can do it both ways. These are just examples of note-taking strategies. Cornell notes are super common. There's a lot of evidence behind using Cornell notes. And then teaching kids to use color, use arrows, draw pictures, use charts, bullet points, doodles, whatever really works for the student to keep them engaged and taking notes. One thing that's really important for note-taking, I think, and that's just important to keep in mind in general, is that effort equals learning. So the more work you put into something to process the information, the more you're going to learn. So if you can imagine taking a full sentence, processing that information, figuring out how to make it shorter and abbreviate it and write down a note, takes a lot more effort than copying a sentence on a computer and pasting it on a different Word document as notes. There's almost no effort there. The student doesn't have to process the information and spit it back out. There's not a lot of effort, so not a lot of learning. So I highly recommend trying to get kids to take notes by hand. We see more and more and more everything happening on screens, everything happening on computer. But what that leaves room for is a lot of copy pasting, not a lot of manipulation of the information. And so it's not as much effective learning happening. These are some different strategies. I thought this chart was cool. It comes from Landmark College, which is a institution that specializes in learning disorders. Just giving some different ideas depending on what the note-taking difficulty is. So that's something you can refer to on your own. Okay, we only have 5 minutes. I was going to go into a case study about a student, but I would rather spend time on questions if you guys have them. Are there any more questions we can answer before I talk quickly about this case study?
It looks like one more just came in about note-taking. What if the student struggles with handwriting? What would you suggest when talking about note-taking and improving that?
So then I would really want to encourage them to use a speech to text. So they're still taking in the information, figuring out how to abbreviate it, but they're talking it to their computer versus, again, the copy pasting. That might require some side-by-side or some adult intervention, especially at first. But I also find that explaining the why behind things to students is really helpful. So explaining to them why I'm being a grouch and making you write things or making you talk things out instead of just copying and pasting. And it's because you'll learn it better. And because science says this about our brain, kids respond really well to that.
Great. Well, that is all the questions. I think Jeannie's still responding to one of the earlier ones, but there aren't any new questions.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
we did
awesome.
answer that other
Awesome.
one. How do you get students to not want to get up several times? I think that we did answer that one aloud. So I think we answered all of them. Is that, yeah, okay.
And it looks like someone's chiming in saying they would really appreciate hearing about the case study if we have time.
Okay, let's do it. We have a couple more minutes. So if you need to go, that's totally fine, but I can definitely talk us through the case study. So this is just an example of a student who wasn't necessarily flagged for support in language. He always kind of flew under the radar because he had decent test scores, but he really, really struggled with executive functioning. That was his main difficulty that led to difficulty with language and with writing. So I'm going to talk you through this. A lot of the information's in my notes and not on the slides, but this is a 16-year-old. His name is George. He was referred for a speech language evaluation at the age of 16. He had been evaluated at 5, at 7, and at 11. And they'd found some kind of minor difficulties with his speech. They mentioned a couple things like word retrieval or complex sentences, but they never recommended speech language therapy. His verbal IQ, this is probably why speech language therapy was never recommended. The verbal part of his IQ was in the 99th percentile. But an IQ test is really looking at single word vocabulary, super short utterances. It's not looking at narratives or essays or a lot of analysis. The part that he really struggled with was information organization and processing speed. He was in the 12th percentile on his cognitive testing on that. So there was a big gap between his verbal knowledge and the pieces that affect executive functioning. So he was referred again for a speech language evaluation at 16 after doing some educational testing. And that was when finally he got recommended for some intervention. The difficulties he was having with speech language included word retrieval, that's executive functioning sometimes, formulating his ideas into complete thoughts, conveying what he was really meaning to say, planning, organizing, developing a theme, being coherent in his writing, and then open-ended discussion, argument, debate was tricky for him as well. The executive functioning difficulties that they found on his assessment were things like impulse control, keeping his focus, generating strategies for himself, flexibility, adapting when he was failing. He was aware of his problem. He tried to use strategies, but he just couldn't figure it out on his own. And he had a lot of difficulty in history and English, where he started to experience some self-doubt because he knew he was smart, but he could not explain himself or get out what he knew. He started participating in speech language therapy. They worked on self-regulation, executive functioning, along with some speech language skills. All of those things were interacting with each other. So this is an example of a kid whose executive functioning was really exacerbating his difficulty with language. And it wasn't super obvious in his test scores. He wasn't falling so far below in his test scores. So he had never been targeted for speech language therapy before. So I want to give you his pre-treatment response. I'm going to give it to you out loud, and then his post-treatment response. So the question was, what kind of feedback do your teachers usually give you about your writing? And this is what he said. See, that's the thing is, I don't know, my English teacher, I do really well most of the time. I mean, there are times where I didn't do well, and definitely situations in my history, but in my history, I usually do really well in my papers. And then she'd have a couple of comments, but this wouldn't really cause a problem. And in English, there's sometimes say that, like, my English teacher will sometimes like, I got a paper back and it was a good grade. I mean, this year it was like, good job. So it goes on and on. I'm not going to keep going, but it's a lot. It's similar to that narrative we saw before. It's a lot of words and not a lot of content. The clinician is kind of trying to probe and figure out what he's trying to say. And then he did speech language therapy. He worked on executive functioning. He worked on planning, organizing, self-monitoring. He used graphic organizers. He worked on inhibiting, pausing, and thinking before he responded. He worked on some different word retrieval strategies. And then his post-treatment response to the question, what is it that attracted you to this specific college? I'm going to read you part of this again. It's really long. I won't read the whole thing. He said, well, there's the honor code, but there are also other parts that I like. I like the idea that it's near a city. It's right outside of Philadelphia. And I think that's important because I like what the city has to offer, the cultural aspects. If I do want to get involved in something political, I have the city venue to use. I also think that there's interesting museums and sites of Philadelphia that I've never seen. It's nice to be in another part of the country. Also, what I like about the school is the size. I feel that I want to know my classmates well, and with it being only 1,200 people, I feel that I'll be able to make long-lasting friendships and I'll be part of a community. So you can see it's a lot more meaningful, it's a lot better organized. And so again, this case study is just to show how important it is to target those executive functioning skills and how intertwined they are with our language skills. And when we work on those executive functioning skills, how much our language can improve. So that's what the case study is all about. And then lastly, we have a ton of references. So if you really want to nerd out and dig in deeper, there's some different references here for you. And again, we mean it when we say our contact information is on our first slide. So if you want to reach out to either of us and you have questions, please feel free to do so.
All right, well, thank you all for coming and thanks for the great questions. Like Megan said, feel free to reach out if others come up as you digest all this info.
Thank you again, everybody. And again, check your emails tomorrow evening for those links to our YouTube channel where we're going to be posting this recording. And they'll also have my contact information. So if you'd like those CEU credits, I'm happy to get you those as well. And again, if you have any other questions, just let us know. Thank you all so much.